that this session will be recorded. I hope none of you mind with this. So today, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Odi. I would like to say welcome to everyone. As every participants, I've seen some familiar names, friends and colleagues, and also that also attended the sessions yesterday. I would like to welcome you to the second session of the Department of History of UGM's event series with Rommel, Curaming, Ph.D. In this very morning, we would like to hear Rommel's remarks on his book that is recently published back in 2020. So it's quite recent. It is yesterday I said to Rommel that publishing a book amidst the pandemic is indeed a sign of productivity that we that everyone should aspire to have. Of course, because of all of the restrictions and limitations, but Rommel managed to do that. But I heard that it has been delayed for almost a decade. But it's better late than never. That's the word. Of course, in this very session, we would like to celebrate the book, of course, in an academic way by discussing it and subsequently share our thoughts and questions concerning the subject matter. As this event is organized by the Department of History, I believe I should give the floor first to Dr. Abdul Wahid, is already here as the head of the History Department, to maybe share his deliver his brief opening remarks. So, Dr. Wahid, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Mas Odi. First of all, I would like to welcome everyone to this virtual meeting. Today we have Dr. Rommel Curaming, who is now introducing his book, new books. Actually, it's published in 2020 last year. Power and Knowledge in Southeast Asia, State and Scholars in Indonesia and the Philippines. As Odi has mentioned, that the book came actually originally from his dissertations, written, I think, back in 2007 or 8, if I'm not mistaken, in ANU, Canberra. So it is quite a long-awaited book, actually, and maybe Rommel can tell why later in his presentations. Yet, I think the topic of the book is still very much relevant until today and maybe in the future, both in Indonesia as well as in the Philippines, since state and scholar was always in intense relationship mutually or sometimes also antagonistically between these two parties. So actually we are still waiting other participants. We have already received hundreds of registers, people who want to join the meeting, but it's always the case that some people came or join later. Maybe we can wait for that. So first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Rommel Curaming, of course, because you are willing to share your book and celebrating it in academic, as Odi has said, today with us. Congratulations, of course, for the book. Finally, it comes out, and I think and very much for your how you call it, your kindness to share the file of the books to all of us. A bit violating copyright, I guess, by Routledge, but that's okay. That's how we do that. And thank you for that. And also, I would like to thank Professor Bambang Purwanto, who will be become a discussion of the book of our session today. And also to our colleagues who are joining our discussion today. I see some colleagues from the Department of History, but also from other institutions in Indonesia, and also students, of course. Welcome to our discussions. And without further ado, I think I would just like to give the floor to Odi to lead to chair the session and have a fruitful discussion. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdul Wahid, for your opening remarks. And I would like to, because I act as a chair and as well as, of course, the moderator, I would like to introduce the speakers as well as the discussants, although, of course, we are familiar with both names. The speaker is Rommel Curaming, Ph.D., a senior assistant professor in the Department of History and International Studies, Universiti Brunei Darussalam. Meanwhile, Professor Bambang Purwanto is a professor in at the Department of History, Universitas Gadjah Mada. So Professor Bambang's inaugural professorship speech deals with the Indonesian historiography that is entitled Sejarawan Akademik dan Disorientasi Historiografi, sebuah autokritik, or academic historian and historiographical disorientation and autokritik. However, when I took my Indonesian historiography course a couple years ago, I can recall how Pak Bambang suggested, or not suggested, required us to read a piece by Rommel Curaming. So that was my first introductions via his writing, which I believe concerns with the nationalist historiography. And I can recall how Pak Bambang really praised this writing. So long story short, both speakers are expert in the subject matter. So thank you very much once again for the participants, and I believe that we will learn a lot from today, not only about the Indonesian historiography but also the Philippines, and both deals with the state-sponsored historiography and also concerns with the relations between the state and the intellectuals, which a small trivia when I was on my way from my home to the campus, I thought about the stories of Pak Sartono. I think in his biography, telling there was a story of him withdrew from the team of who writes the Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, and that raises my questions. What happened? And then I think this is one. It's not small, but one example of what we are going to discuss today. Without further ado, I would like to pass the floor and the screen to Rommel. So, Rommel, please.
Okay, thank you, Audie, for the introduction. Let me begin by tracing the earliest germ of this book. Sometime in 2000, year 2000, I was studying for a master's degree in NUS. And it's the first time that I got exposed to anything Southeast Asian, because before I had no interest in Southeast Asia. And a friend of mine whom I asked to do some research, gather materials for me back in the Philippines, when he sent the textbooks that I'm going to analyze for my final research project, he included in the box a conference paper, and the conference paper happened to be written by Pak Bambang. So he was talking about his critique of the nationalist historiography sometime in 2000. So now that particular piece of work by Pak Bambang, it turned out to be a defining moment in my trajectory, in my career as an academic. Because during the time I was applying for fellowship from the Ford Foundation, and when I was interviewed. Before the interview, about 2 hours before the interview, I woke up early in the morning. I read that paper by Pak Bambang, and during the interview, because I read that paper by Pak Bambang, I appeared so knowledgeable about Indonesia. And the people in the panel, I remember one of the panelists there, Ariel Herianto, was so impressed by what I was saying. So that enabled me to get the fellowship that allowed me to stay in Indonesia, do further research, to study Bahasa Indonesia in Malaysia, I mean, in UGM, in INCOLS. And for 9 months, I did further research on historiography. And because of that, when I applied for a PhD scholarship at ANU, I also got the scholarship because I had already a prior exposure to the kind of topic I proposed. And so the rest is history. My trajectory has been defined by that moment. That during the time, I had no idea that was going to happen. Only looking back, that my interest in Indonesian historiography turns out to be that defining moment at that particular point. And this interest has been developed further, and it found much of it in this book that I'm going to share with you today. So I'd like to thank Bambang I'm one of those he inspired, okay, with his critique of nationalist historiography in Indonesia. And I really appreciate the germ thoughts, the ideas that that he nurtured among younger scholars like me, and also those that are emerging in Indonesia right now. Okay, so this book, the focus in this particular book, I tried to compare the dynamics of the relationship between state and scholars in the two countries during Suharto and Marcos periods. And I analyzed this using the projects, the two state-sponsored projects, Sejarah Nasional Indonesia and Tadhana project. Now, whenever we talk about state-sponsored history writing project or official history, we have this common idea that scholars are, these conventional views of scholarship politics relation, wherein the scholars are viewed as manipulated or co-opted, and history they write is distorted as some kind of a propaganda. And scholars that are involved in this kind of project, usually they're being called intellectual prostitutes, academic mercenaries, they are co-opted, they sold off. And this kind of labels, there is this presumption of what is ideal. And the ideal is scholars are supposed to be impartial. They're supposed to rise above politics. They're supposed to not be involved with any of this kind of political activities. And they're supposed to be, if ever they would be involved in politics, they're supposed to assume the role of public intellectual, the one who speak truth to power. So that is in this formulation, scholarship stands in opposition to the political. And if you are a good scholar, the measure of good scholarship is, you have to get things right empirically, methodologically, theoretically, to neutralize the political. So if you don't manage to neutralize the political, then you are not a good scholar. And that's the reason why, we keep on this kind of fact-checking, for example, that is quite common nowadays in their effort to neutralize populist leaders like Trump, for example, or Duterte in the Philippines, for instance. And they said that these people are spewing all this kind of fake news. And so the tendency of scholars is to fact-check, to correct, to expose the lies. So this idea of scholarship politics relation, this is normally considers the liberal view of this kind of relationship. And in this book, I acknowledge that there are indeed aspects of the two projects that fall under this framework, that we can understand such relation using this kind of framework. But I went beyond that. I argued in the book that it's only one of the possible ways by which we can understand scholarship-politics relation. And in this presentation, in this book, I invite you to have an open mind. I'll be saying quite a lot of things that might not be that might not sit well with our common beliefs as scholars, as historians. But just be open about the possibilities of an alternative view. Okay, so the book, just to give a very quick rundown of the table of contents. So chapter 1 of the book is I try to tease out in detail the different ways by which power and knowledge relation has been explicated in various studies. Chapter 2, I analyze the context, compared the context specifically focusing on the 1970s, 60s, 70s in Indonesia and the Philippines. So I focus on factors that can help me better understand the dynamics of the relationship between scholars and state in the succeeding chapters. Third chapter focuses on the Tadhana project, how Tadhana project came about. Fourth chapter looks into the political and historiographic context of Tadhana. Fifth chapter, I focus on the Sejarah Nasional Indonesia. How did it come about? The story of how did it come about? And chapter 6 focuses on the contents and context, politics, and the historiographic context of Sejarah Nasional Indonesia. And 7 is the most difficult chapter in this book. This is where I do the comparison, comparative analysis, and I try to tease out some important key points. Finally, conclusion. So just to give you an idea, I'll be focusing more on Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, but just a bit on Tadhana project. Tadhana project is a very ambitious project to produce 21 volumes of supposedly complete Philippine history. So the scope is really massive, starting from the Big Bang and the geological formation of the Philippine archipelago, all the way to the 1970s, when the new society by Marcos was established. So it started about 1973-74 and lasted until 1986. 1986 was when EDSA revolution happened that swept the Marcos regime away. And because of that, the project was really never completed. It never get completed. And it's participated by some of the most capable young UP scholars. And because of that, mainly because of that, it was a very controversial project. Precisely because scholars from University of the Philippines, supposedly the most progressive and usually the most critical of the state, why would they participate in a project like this? Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, it's 6 volumes, but later was expanded. And it started around the same time, 1971 to 1975. Unlike Tadhana project, it was completed. Not just completed, but it underwent several revisions. So just like Tadhana, it's a government project, and best scholars in Indonesia participated in this. It was welcome in the beginning, but it became really controversial when completed. So, Sejarah Nasional Indonesia is an exemplar of an official history. And as an official history, it's commonly perceived, and it's really true. The idea is so predictable, so boring, and the scholars here were manipulated, history was distorted, those common idea. And actually, I remember this American scholar when I met him in one of the conferences during the time, and I told him that my thesis, I would do analysis of Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, and he told me that oh, Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, historiography of Indonesia. Can you? Isn't it the case that you can summarize that in one sentence? So that kind of comment that I got, and while I was hoping, because I had no idea, I was just starting during the time. I was hoping that that was not the case. But his comment encapsulates, looking back, that encapsulates the very common perception of Sejarah Nasional Indonesia as something that is very predictable. It's so boring. What else do we need to know? Why do you study? Why would you do a PhD thesis on something like that? So that's the idea. So, but deep inside me, I was hoping that it's not going to be like that. But at the same time, I feel that kind of possibility that it might indeed be the case. So I just comforted myself by thinking that, okay, I have Tadhana project, and Tadhana project is really very exciting. It's a project that really deserves analysis. Nobody has done analysis for Tadhana project. I was the first. Still, I'm the only one who really dealt with the project. So even if SNI would turn out to be really boring, at least I have another one to fall back on. So I continued. Now, it didn't take long for me to realize that this common perception of Sejarah Nasional Indonesia may be wrong. When I finished reading the volume 6 of the original edition, the 1975 edition, I was shocked by that volume, because it ended in a way that was really puzzling for me. How could an official history end like that? Okay, after October 1. Few days later, it just ended just like that. Not much mention of if the idea of official history is to validate, to justify the new order. Why was not anything said about that? So just on that account alone, I realized that there's really something in Sejarah Nasional Indonesia that deserves to be looked into. And one thing, in due course, I realized that when we talk about Sejarah Nasional Indonesia as an official history, the first question that needs to be asked is which one of the SNI is the truly that kind of official history. So at least 3 that we can say: the original edition, the SNI SMP, the Sejarah Nasional Indonesia untuk SMP, so the textbook that came soon after the release of this book in 1975, and 1984 edition. There's another 1993. So these are the main thing. And the point I was trying to drive at is, if you do this kind of nuanced reading of these different versions, we've realized that the original 1975 edition was the least propagandistic, but it was the most criticized. And the textbook, the SNI SMP 1976, that was the least noticed, but the most virulent. It would take a decade later before the textbook would begin to be noticed as truly problematic. For the first 10 years, 9-10 years of its existence, the attention of the people is focused on the original, the 1975 edition. I detailed in the book this kind of criticisms of this edition, but they didn't pay attention to this textbook until 1985 and 1987. So other things revealed by a nuanced reading of the SNI. The 1984 edition was closer to the textbook than to the 1975 edition. And the explanation for that is the 1975 edition was still under the helm of Sartono Cartoderjo. Nugroho had the full control over the writing of the textbook and the 1984 edition. And I also detailed in the book the dynamics that went into this. So another point that I was I realized in analyzing SNI was that Sartono's multidimensional approach and the contemporary history as not yet history idea set the limit to Nugroho's plans. We normally take, I still remember Contovejoyo's critique of scientific history, and he said that it's really, it's being impartial, it ends up just being serving the interest of the government. But one thing that I realized when I analyzed why is it that the textbook was so different from the 1975 edition, and it's so much closer to the 1984 edition. And that's when I realized that with Sartono at the helm, he imposed this kind of multidimensional approach. And also, it was debated during the sessions, the workshops they had there about this notion of contemporary history as not yet history. These two main things set the limit to Nugroho's plan. And that's the reason why the original SNI ended just like that. And it was so much milder. It could, as a propaganda, it was a very bad propaganda, because people who would read that would need more details so that they would feel this kind of particular emotion that they like readers to generate. Something that was not there in the original edition, but it was there in the textbook as well as in the 1984 edition. So what goes with the multidimensional approach is it does away with the narrative chronological approach that Nugroho preferred. And there is also dynamics between this choice of the narrative as well as the analytical approach that multidimensional approach prefer. So I've also seen as well the variations across different versions, and there are passages in both 1975 and 1984 edition that contradict official interpretations of the nature of the so-called coup 1965. So if the idea is it is supposed to be an official history that validates the interest of the regime, why a passage like that would appear is something that also proves striking for me. So what are some of the key comparative points between the two projects? Okay, I first point, because this is going to be an important point in the succeeding slides, historical profession in the Philippines was more developed than in Indonesia by the 1970s. Okay, so while in Indonesia during the time, there were only 2 PhDs whose area of specialization is Indonesian history. In the Philippines, as early as 1920s, PhDs were already there, and the local universities are also producing PhDs. In Indonesia, the first PhD locally produced was Nugroho Santo, and that was 1977. So that's one important point to note comparatively. So the SNI started, okay, SNI proceeded despite scholars' lack of confidence in their capability. Sartono didn't believe that they were ready to undertake this kind of project. So until the last minute, he was very hesitant to do this. He knew that they lacked intellectual resources to do this. Tadhana, on the other hand, it was born out of scholars' confidence in their ability, not just as scholar, but also ability to withstand the controlling impulses coming from Marcos. So they had this kind of confidence in themselves that if we're going to be pressured to do something we don't like, we're just going to resign. Okay, so that kind of thing, that attitude of the Tadhana scholars. Another point is that SNI was completed, Tadhana remained incomplete. By 1986, only 5 volumes came out of the 21. Actually, much of these volumes have already been drafted. But by 1980s, Marcos already started to get sick, and sick. He got sick even more seriously as time went on. And the drafts of many of these volumes, they never had a chance to really sit down and take a look. So that's one of the main reasons why it never get, only 5 volumes came out. Okay, another point is the controversy surrounding SNI. It was played out in public. So right the moment it came out in 1976, so a lot of reviews, so all this kind of debates, that was done publicly in the media. In Tadhana, on the other hand, they were confined within a small group of anti-Marcos scholars and activists. So it's a small, within a small community among scholars. And many of them are anti-Marcos. Okay, so all Tadhana scholars were vilified. For SNI, it was mainly Nugroho who bore the brunt of criticism. But for Tadhana scholars, anyone who participated, they were crucified, they were vilified in the Philippines. They were given with all this kind of very derogatory remarks like intellectual prostitutes, sell-offs, those kind of things. So another important point, okay, so the logistics of power relations in the 2 projects are very different. So you can see that in the context, in the content, the people who were, the dynamics of the relationship between scholars and the state, very different. But there is they share fundamentally similar logic. This power relation, despite the difference in the logistics, in terms of logic, they are fundamentally the same. And what is that kind of logic? That those who have power will need knowledge to strengthen itself, and those who have knowledge requires power in order for their knowledge to be pushed. So that is the fundamental logic that is similar in the 2 projects. It's only in the dynamics, in the distribution and the dynamics of power relation that they differ. Okay, so let me encapsulate in a couple of key points. What are the key takeaways? Okay, in this book. So again, I mentioned earlier, I invite you to be open-minded, to keep an open mind on this, because I'll be saying quite a lot of things that goes against a lot of our common ideas about scholarship, about knowledge, about the idea of the political. So I'll be saying a lot of things that goes against our common ideas. And so I'll invite you to keep an open mind here. Okay, first takeaway. There are indeed elements in the 2 projects that support conventional view. Marcos allowed scholars free rein. practically, he allowed this kind of freedom. The scholars designed the project. They didn't. They drafted all this kind of the concept, the approaches. So he didn't pay attention too much in that. The scholars were given all this kind of freedom, but not in the chapters directly relevant to his reign. So Marcos encroached on the volume that is specifically relevant to his time, 1966 onward. All the rest, he didn't bother with that. Also, SNI is replete with biases against Sukarno, Old Order, and PKI, and the PKI. So we can see that the conventional idea of the scholarship-politics relation being oppositional, we can find in these two projects. But one thing I'd like to emphasize, I highlighted in the book, is this is only one of the possibilities. There are instances that we can see in the projects that they are complementary, that the political and the scholarly, they complement each other. They needed each other. And that is particularly true in the case of Marcos, as I'm going to discuss in the next slide. So there are also instances when this relationship, they just run parallel. They run parallel. Marcos had his own interest. The scholars have their own. And there, at the most, is this mutually constitutive relationship. So this oppositional relationship is often emphasized. The conventional view is often emphasized, while other possibilities are downplayed. And I argue in the book that it is because it serves the interest of the scholarly class. It is in the interest of the scholarly class. It is in their politics to be seen as non-political, disinterested, as neutral. It is the wellspring of the power of the scholarly class, that is their politics, to be seen as non-political. Okay, takeaway number 2. We normally think that if the scholarship is weak, then it is susceptible to political manipulation. Okay, and if scholarship is strong, then it can withstand political manipulation. So that's a common consequence of our conventional view. But in this, I've shown in the book that it doesn't necessarily follow. So, for example, Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, despite the weaknesses in scholarly terms, multidimensional approach, for example, I discussed this in the book, multidimensional approach may have been poorly carried out. Okay, a lot of complaints about that, particularly coming from Sartono himself. But despite the poor implementation of multidimensional approach, it set the limit to achievable to what Nugroho could achieve politically. So even if it is weak, scholarly speaking, it managed to set that kind of restriction to what Nugroho wanted. On the other hand, Tadhana project, the scholars are very strong. The scholars are very confident about their own ability. And yet, okay, I mentioned earlier, professionalization of history was far ahead in the Philippines by the 1970s. And that informs, that is what makes the scholars very confident about their ability to ward off manipulation. However, Marcos, a very scholarly history is what Marcos precisely needed. Marcos precisely needed, it took so long for Marcos to find scholars who would agree to participate in the project. It could have been so much easier for him to just assign military historians, because they have military historians who would do whatever Malacanang and the armed forces would like them to do. But Marcos didn't like them. He did whatever he could for several years. He looked for the best and the brightest Filipino scholars. And what is the reason for that? Marcos wanted a history that is rigorously researched, that's something that can withstand critical scrutiny in test of time. Because Marcos knew very well that this history that he's supposedly writing, actually scholars are writing it for him, he knew very well that it would not be believed in by people during his time. It would easily be trashed by people in the 1970s, the contemporary generation. Marcos was setting his eyes on future generation. And he believed that because these people in the future generation are far removed from the contemporary politics, then they would be supposedly be able to judge better the project and himself. So in other words, Marcos wanted to use Tadhana as a vehicle to explain himself to the people 50, 100 years later, because he believed that these people would understand what he did during the time. Okay, takeaway number 3. We have this common idea that the contents determine the political. Okay, so the political, it depends on the content. But in this case, for example, there is this volume in Tadhana project that specifically focus on the geological formation of the Philippine archipelago. And this kind of question of what politics can there be in rock formation? Okay, what politics can there be in rock formation? It's a very dry, very technical discussion of how Philippine archipelago was formed. Okay, so there's really no politics there. However, if we take that within the bigger framework of Tadhana, and by the way, one of the main thing in Tadhana is the assertion of the indigenous. Tadhana project is one of the earliest post-colonial history. Actually, it decenters. All this talks about decentering the colonial period was very well done in Tadhana. In Tadhana, the Philippine state and the Philippine nation had been formed already. The bedrock of that had been formed before the colonization happened. Okay, so colonization happened is not really that important insofar as the formation of the Philippine indigenous state and Philippine indigenous nation. So the idea, Marcos, politically, what he wanted to show is the Marxist and the liberal approach, liberal form of nationalism and the Marxist critique, all of these were Western formulated. And in his formulation, in his idea, the problem that the Philippines had during the time is precisely because of those Western influences. So we have to come up with a political system that is based on the indigenous. So that's the reason why, within the context of the entire framework of Tadhana, rock formation assume a political significance because it allows the scholars to claim that Filipino identity it goes all the way back to how the rocks were formed. It is how it is it is that authentic. Okay, so another participant said this in his views, he said, so long as I work on topics centuries far removed from the Marcos years, such as pre-Hispanic or Spanish period, I am politically safe. No one can say that I sold my soul to Marcos. But again, if you see it within the broad contour framework of Tadhana, and knowing Marcos' interest in this doesn't work. This claim doesn't work. Okay, all of those, even regardless of what period you're working on, you contribute to the formation of the big picture, Philippine history that is based on the indigenous. So that's the idea behind this. Okay? It's not the content that determines the political. It is actually the context of actual knowledge use that ultimately decides what is the political. So within the pages of Tadhana, hardly anyone has taken seriously its innovative approach as an idea, because it is associated with Marcos. It's under the authorship of Marcos, so whatever serious scholarship put into it, it was easily dismissed. But one similar approach has been developed outside of Tadhana project. It gained respectability and acceptance as non-political. Pantayong pananaw, for example, Psikolohiyang Pilipino. These approaches, these are essentially similar to what you can find in Tadhana. So long as it is within the Tadhana, nobody paid attention to the idea. But once it was developed outside of Tadhana, they assume respectability. So that's the idea of this kind of context. Outside of Tadhana, it's no longer political. But within Tadhana, it is political. So that is the idea behind this kind of the context that decides. And yeah, again, about the highly technical discussion of rock formation. Okay, so takeaway number 4. Okay, this is another important point. Okay, we normally see history as something that is just used by the political power holder, and so that's our common idea. History is used. Now, when we ask the other question, why, and ask, for example, why political legitimation must be based on scholarly history? Why it must be done through the use of scholarly history? If dictators like Marcos or Suharto regime, very powerful they are, what does it imply that they need a kind of history that is scholarly? So if we push ourselves to think about this question, we will realize that scholarship is indeed very powerful. Marcos himself, the very idea of a scholarly history really fascinates him. He wanted something like that. Okay, so he envied historians for having that kind of power. And his effort to supposedly write this history is an act of political power holder trying to assume the power that he doesn't have, the power of the scholars. So that is the point of this idea. Well, we have to acknowledge that scholarship is powerful. We normally don't do that, okay, because part of our power rests on the need for us not to be seen as powerful. If we are seen as powerful, then we lose that legitimacy to act supposedly impartial. So our power as a scholar rests on the idea that we are not powerful, and that is the front that we have to keep. Okay, final takeaway. We think that official history are exceptions. Okay, because there are not really that many official histories. In a country, yeah, the history that the state offers, that's the official history. But other histories can be written. Okay, so it's so easy for us to see to say that official histories are exceptional. But if we take deeper on this, so the partnership between power and knowledge that manifests in official history projects may not really be an exception. It may be the norm. And such partnership merely formalizes and makes explicit the transactional relationship happening on day-to-day basis between knowledge and its consumers. If you take a look how we consume knowledge every day, okay, each of us will something like shopping on the marketplace of ideas, and we take one particular knowledge that is useful for us, and if this knowledge is not useful for us, we don't take it. Other people might take it, have a different view. Okay, so you see, we can see here that on day-to-day basis, this transaction is happening between the fusion between the powerful and the knowledgeable. Okay, between the powerful and the knowledgeable, and we see each and every individual has their own power to choose which kind of knowledge they have. So you will see this kind of transaction happening every day, and what official history does is merely formalizes, make it explicit on the bigger scale. Okay, so the reason why official history is objectionable, okay, the reason why scholars who participate in official histories are rejected, they are called as intellectual prostitutes or academic mercenaries, is precisely because, as I reviewed in the book, they make it explicit, something that is supposed to be kept secret among the scholars. So there is this kind of common understanding among scholars that we should be impartial, okay, that we should be objective. But these scholars who explicitly participate in Marcos project or Sarto project, for example is Nogroho, by doing this, they make it explicit, this kind of transaction. And by making it explicit, it endangers the power, the collective power of the scholarly class. And that's the reason why they have to be kicked out of the community of scholars by calling them not true scholars, by calling them they are intellectual prostitutes. True scholars are actually the ones who don't participate in this. But if you take a look at even all scholars, even the most objective, impartial scholars, the most scientific scholars, their knowledge is being used by anyone, any group, any country that will find it useful for them. So that is happening on day-to-day basis. Whether scholarship is good or bad, accurate or not, there are always people out there who will use it, who will buy it in the marketplace of ideas. Okay, so so that's the last takeaway. I just like to conclude with a couple of points. I emphasize the primacy of context, and I also noted that being objective, impartial is not really a neutral position. That neutrality is the source, the wellspring of power of scholars. So that is the main basis of the politics of scholars. And this kind of neutrality, claim to neutrality and rigor, is what makes scholarship very useful for political purpose. Okay, so we were thinking that these politicians, in their mind, the kind of knowledge that they use are objective knowledge, the truthful knowledge. because that strengthens their own position. They don't like relativism. The reason why not just scholars but politicians, they don't like relativism, subjectivity, is precise. They prefer actually being objective. It's precisely because it serves their purpose as their political purpose. And if a particular knowledge criticizes them, they can always find other knowledge that will be supportive of them. So they're just going to buy here and there whatever it is that they find useful. So what did this mean? Okay, towards the end of the book, I try to, what is the point of doing all this kind of thing? I am gearing towards reorienting progressive scholarship. Okay, one of the main impetus for writing the book this way is my anxiety about the progressive scholarship. Progressive scholarship, when we say progressive scholarship, we're referring to scholarship that explicitly would like to help the marginalized, common people. They like to be empowered, so they do this by being critical. Okay, so that's the reason why we have post-colonial theory, decolonial theory, post-structuralism, cultural studies. So that's the reason why progressive scholarship is critical scholarship. But what I'm trying to argue here in the book is different. I'm saying that if we really wish to help common people, being critical is not enough. Okay, we have to go beyond critique. Okay, we have to go beyond critique, because when you critique, you merely affirm one politics over another. And subaltern people, that's not what they need to be empowered. Subaltern people, what they need is the kind of knowledge that will help them understand their position in society. Why are they in that inferior position? What kind of knowledge will enable them to get out of that position? So, in other words, progressive scholarship must look into how particular knowledge, whether it is accurate or not, how actually they are being used. Okay, the reason why I emphasize the context of knowledge use that determines the political is precisely because of this. The context is the one that decides what is political, what is advantageous for one group or not. In progressive scholarship, this kind of critical approach tends to take things because of the rationality, because of their theory. They tend to take things on a blanket scale, okay, not on an individual local scale. Because for some people, for certain group of scholars, it may be advantageous, but for common people, it is not. So progressive scholarship, critical. I'd like progressive scholarship to go beyond critical and to do the cartography in accountancy of power-knowledge relation. What do I mean by cartography? This means mapping out how particular knowledge is being used, at what particular context, by whom, during what time, and with what particular consequence to certain group and other groups. So that is the cartography of power knowledge. Rather than criticizing, what the common people need is this kind of mapping. Okay, so examine how each of this knowledge, whether it is true or not, whether it is accurate or not, how they actually operate on the ground, how they actually affect people on the ground. So in other words, it's not about accuracy, which is also what the progressive scholarship, critical scholarship has been trying to do, like other scientists. It's not about accuracy, that really matters, but the pragmatics, the use, the actual use of knowledge that will be more beneficial for common people. And that's the main point that I look forward to when I ended the book. So thank you very much. I might have gone beyond time. Sorry for that. Thank you very much. That's all I can say now. Thank you.
Thank you, Rommel. A very thought-provoking, I believe, but I think I need to directly pass the floor to Pak Bambang. So, Pak Bambang, the floor is yours. But before that, if the participants already have questions, both in English and Bahasa, please type it in the chat. I will read it for the speaker or the discussant. Thank you.
Thank you, Odi. Rommel, welcome back home. To GM, although only online. I mean, I know that it is really one of your homes, really. Yeah. First of all, I would like to congratulate and thank you for doing such interesting and important books on historiography of Indonesia and the Philippines, but also I think in Southeast Asia. I mean, I thought one thing that we never discussed. I think if you would like to expand it, I think historiography of Singapore may be really interesting to discuss. But one thing, you know, before we come to the serious part, I think you didn't tell us about your experience when you are traveling with all train or Indonesian train from Jogja to Jakarta. Our old train, it's really you know, maybe you have that experience. I remember, but I believe you will not have the same thing. You know, in our now much better train system now in Indonesia. Now I recommended you when you come to Indonesia to travel by train again, because our train is far better now. Yeah. Okay. You declare yourself as a liberal, you know, liberal in the sense. I mean, I'm personally, I can say that I'm not really a liberal historical thinker, but I would like to keep the main principle, you know, taught by my guru, Sartono Katudirjo and Kunto Wijoyo, about what they call it critical history and historiography as social critics. So although I don't follow your path as maybe consider as a liberal thinker on historical construction, but I mean, to some extent, I really like to you know, admire what you have done on the books. We are really talking about what you call it a state-sponsored history writing project. You know, you mentioned about scholarly history as a legitimacy, and I then directly remember what Daniel Dakidai, one of our late very important Indonesian scholar, in his book Cendekiawan dan Kekuasaan dalam Negara Orde Baru. I think it's a very interesting books to read. Although he you know, he doesn't really explore much on that issue, but at least he mentioned something on this. And I think this is a part of a very interesting way how to remember the new orders. And unfortunately, Rommel, I'm not going to touch your Tadana, because you know, my knowledge on the Philippine historiography only rely on my experience of undergraduate student who follow the course on the Philippine history delivered by two prominent historians of the country. If I'm not mistaken, the name is Professor Rosario Mendoza Cortez, who wrote something on Pangasinan, and Professor Leslie Boson when they both visited the university for many years ago. So that's no. Because of that, I just want to say something on the Indonesian historiography, especially when we are talking about the SNE. You put your study on two very important thing. I just read what you have written. What you call it, the persistence of analytic constipation. I like this words. I like. I don't know. It might be in Bahasa Indonesia we can call it kebukuan or something like that, because constipation in terms of medical thing is something that terrible to, yeah. If you have something happen to your stomach and something like that, you choose I think a very interesting word on this. Because you said that this revert to the tendency among scholars and other analysts who apply scholarly convention to stay safe within the well-accepted boundary and to downplay, ignore, hide, or hold back certain key aspect of analysis due to unconscious or conscious effort to uphold certain analytic, political, moral, ethical, and whatever predisposition. I think this I would like to quote this because I think this is very important. The second you said, the partial admission of the deeply political nature of scholarship is sustained by the lack of attention to exemplary cases which typically the subtle and nuance the intermixing between power and knowledge. So, and then in the other part of your book, and then you ask, what happened when the truth and goodness interact with supreme power and self-interest? This is I mean, for me, why I like this kind of thing. I remember when I met Pak Sartono and I asked him, was there anybody asked you to write, how to write and what to write when you were writing Sejarah Nasional Indonesia? And he directly told me, no, nobody told me, nobody asked me. He said, nobody asked me. I think this is and I believe him. I believe him. I think Sartono was so confidence about his approach, how to write history, and in fact he was succeed to do that. The whole volumes from volume 1 to volume 6, whatever volume 6, which was criticized highly by the publics, but the way how the books were structured, really follow his methodology, his way, how to approach history. I think Sartono was so confident on that. And I think in the other sense, maybe also, he didn't want to involve in politics. And I think when you said that, something that you said that analytical constipation is analytically convenient. I think that's really a good point. So we can see then Sartono wrote his 2-volume books on Sejarah Indonesia Baru, but it's ended in the period of the late colonial period. And he didn't do the next periods, the Japanese times, the revolution, and even you know, the 1950s and then the new orders. And we didn't, you know, we don't really know, you know, we don't really know, you know, what really Pak Sartono wanted to do when he was asked to write the later periods. So this is like he avoided it. So I think that's a very clear point on this. So, but I would like to say here, although you already mentioned that, you know, Nugroho really like a single person who should responsible to the problem of SNE. But I think edition people considered. I think it's not really by, yeah. And then I think we also should not put whole burden. I agree with you. One of the problem is lack of research. Yeah. Lack of research, in consequence, you know, there was like a deep dependency on colonial sources and the product of colonial historical writing. That's for the period, for the volume 1 to volume, at least to the volume 5. Now, when we come to the volume 6, why I said it's not really bad. You can see how rich the sources, how the book was structured, even the volume 6, you know, that's so interesting. No, but then when you come to the problem in terms of Nugroho, I think something that I don't know, is it because you miss or something like what? Because Nugroho wrote an article entitled Problems in the Study and Teaching of National History in Indonesia in Journal of Southeast Asian History in March, published in March 1965. So before, you know, before September 1965, so before the military come to power. And the whole idea, if we follow very, very closely, the most of the idea about how and what to be written in national history book really, you know, follow what of his idea in 1965. So this is so interesting. We see here, you know, and Yusmar Basri told me, the late, I think it's already late Yusmar Basri told me. He said, when Nugroho become a very powerful, you know, person, and then become the Minister of Education, he introduced what then become a PSPB, Pendidikan Sejarah Perjuangan Bangsa, but at the same time, he still keep the you know, sejarah Indonesia and sejarah umum. And Yusuf Basri told me, I don't know, you know, we have to, I don't know how to, you know, to compare with other sources on this thing. And Yusmar Basri told me about this. And I like to maybe to conclude on this, that might be Nugroho would like to, to save, you can say, the history as a science, and bring PSPB to make you know, in favor of the regime at the time. So this is something so interesting. I mean, try to follow all of this kind of yeah. The other thing that I would like to mention here again is not many people. I think also the books also doesn't mention is the volume 7. Yeah, the volume 7 of Sejarah Nasional Indonesia. Maybe can you put a close Odi on this one? This is the books. Yeah, if you this is the books, the volume 7, Buku Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, published in 1993. Yeah, published. So before it's still under the new order. The books title of the books is let me see, Lahir dan Berkembangnya Orde Baru. The writer is Anhar Gonggong, RZ Leiriza, Saleh A. Jamhari, Susanto Zuhdi, Zulfikar Ghazali, Muhammad Iskandar, and Sri Suchiningsih. So you can see most of them connected very closely to one of the university in Jakarta. Yeah. Now, but the book officially published in 1993 by Department of Education and Culture, but never been distributed openly to public. Even some, I think most people don't really realize there is this such book. So I think it will be very interesting if you also put here, you know, the volume 7. This volume 7 is oh my God, I cannot say the volume 7. I mean, it will be very interesting if you elaborate this, you know, in next article, maybe when you are written this, you know, with the volume 7. And in another thing, again, if we would like to discuss about relation between intellectual and political power in terms of Indonesian history, I think it will be better to explore other kind of history-related project, such as what they call it. They call it the project inventarisasi dan dokumentasi sejarah nasional, and another project is inventarisasi dan dokumentasi kebudayaan daerah, and then kebudayaan nasional as well. So they have EDSN, EDKN, EDKD, you know, something like that, and that's project. And I think it's really will give even more picture the relation between the political power and intellectual. Why? Because most of those who involved in the project, we can say scholars. Yeah, mostly of them are scholars, and historian were very dominant on the project. Although some anthropologists and other disciplines. So this kind of approach might be very interesting to understand, you know, the new order after Dani Dakidai have done it in his books, and you contributed very important piece of works. But I have one question for you, Rommel. I hope, you know, this is only one question, no more. In terms of liberal historical thinking, do you think that Indonesia in that sense still need Indonesian centrism historiography or Indonesian centrism perspective? Congratulations, Rommel. Thank you very much for your attention.
Terima kasih, Pak. Thank you. And I believe before the questions goes into the thin air, Rommel should address it. So that will be the beginning of our discussion. So Rommel, please.
Okay, so whether we still need or Indonesia would still need Indonesia centrism, it's up to the Indonesian people to decide on this. Lately, one thing I noticed is because you see, when I first become interested in Indonesia, 2000, 2001, you compared what was then and what has been happening in the past, say, 10 years. I was amazed at the transformation of Indonesia in the span of this short period of time. One thing that amazed me is the transformation of nationalism. That kind of intensity, particularly if this is often intensified vis-a-vis with Malaysia, for example. In 2000, 2001, that early time, the level of confidence. So I started to be exposed to Indonesia at the time when the level of confidence to being an Indonesian was probably in the all-time low. So a lot of this kind, the threat of disintegration, all this kind of violence in different parts in Maluku, for example. So all this possibility that Indonesia will break down or that kind of disintegrate, that was very high during the time. And so the atmosphere that I could sense among Indonesian is that kind of low sense of identity. Right now, significantly, it's no longer the case. The confidence, and it's not just projected by the government, but even among ordinary Indonesians, you can see that sense of sense of pride. And whether Indonesia centrism would still be useful as a historical framework, it really will. There will always be historians who will keep on attaching themselves to the interest of the nation state, and they like to make themselves useful. But for others who would like to have a more exciting life, the nationalistic, the nation-centric kind of history is probably it has already seen its days. So it's your choice as a historian, but there will always be historians, because insofar as the history of nationalism in history is concerned, nation and history has always been that kind of close connection. So they are partners for so long. So we can always expect historians to be closely tied to the state, if not the state, other centers of power. But again, if you are, like for example, our young scholar, Indonesian historians, I'm sure they would like their life to be more exciting and do something, not really focus on the nation. Okay, that's all I can say for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Bambang.
Rommel. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, because the first question reverts to the same, more or less the same topic. Maybe this is addressed to Pak Bambang, but the question was about the failure of the Indonesian historiography, which I believe was taken from Pak Bambang's book. But I think we have touched upon that more or less. It's not about whether the question is beyond that. I believe it's about whether it's beyond the question of failure. So does it work? But whether it's still relevant in this very context. Okay, then because I believe that has been addressed, then I will go to questions from Dr. Arif Akyat. Okay, his question is about the intellectual tensions between scholars and states hegemony in the 16th and 70s. I think this applies for both cases. Maybe to before you address it, I also have something in my mind that I don't know what's the case in the Philippines, but the case in Indonesia, all of the historians that wrote the Sejarah Nasional Indonesia, to a certain extent, were or are civil servants. So they're the employees of the government. So how could they? This is something that hardly escape. I think this although it's a sound, it seems trivial. Is the employment status. But maybe the big question is, what is the intellectual tension? Do you see the intellectual tensions when the state became hegemonic between 1960s and 70s?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Arif, for the question. And also Odi for your question about that kind of being a civil servant. An interesting difference between the case of the Philippines and Indonesia. His lecturers in University of the Philippines, even if they are civil servant, they are very critical of the state usually. So it's a long tradition of the university that, to be critical of the state. And so being a civil servant, it assumes a different kind of meaning in the Philippine context than in the case of Indonesia. The notion of civil servant in the Philippines that is quite the same as in Indonesia applies to others in the bureaucracy, but not in the academia. So there is no assumption or expectation that those employed in the state universities will not criticize the state. Actually, it's their choice whether to do so or not. And the state is not, unlike in the Indonesian case, you're expected to abide by the national line, the government policies. So this kind of tension between the intellectuals and the state. Okay. Let's put it in this way. And this is particularly clear in the case of the Philippines. In Indonesia, because of the 1965, a lot of really promising, very good intellectuals have been wiped out by that event. And so much of the left and a lot of those in the left, they are also very articulate, vocal, with all this kind of ideas. With the 1965-66 killings, they have been wiped out. So what was left in Indonesia are intellectuals who survived that purge. And they knew very well the consequence of what will happen to them if they say something really very opposing to the state. That kind of experience, the Philippines did not have that kind of experience. So the anti-state sentiments, particularly among lecturers from the University of the Philippines, there has been a long tradition of that. Now, I'd like to clarify though, that because these intellectuals who are critical of the state, they normally also are in alignment with the journalists who also might have studied from the University of the Philippines, also very critical towards the state. So they are the vocal ones. They are the ones easily seen in the media. They have the presence in the media, for example. So they're easily seen. And because they're easily seen, it creates an impression that there are many of them, okay, that the intellectuals are really anti-state. Actually, they are a minority, even in the University of the Philippines. It's possible that they are in the minority. Okay? So a lot of UP lecturers as well they favored the Marcos regime. Okay, and they just kept quiet because the dominant politics in the campus is anti-state. But they just kept quiet. So you see here a multitude of either pro-Marcos, or they don't really care about politics. They just like to do whatever scholarship they like to do. I think these are the majority. And even if they are the majority, they're easily overshadowed by the vocal few. And that is what we see to be the intellectuals against the state. But in terms of number, they really do not represent the entire population. In the same, so this tension between intellectuals and the state that we see, these are tensions between a small group of people who have the guts, okay, have the courage to do it, despite knowing the possible consequences. Most other people, both in Philippines and Indonesia, most of them just kept quiet, or they favor the other side of the political. Yeah, so that's what I can say about that.
Well, thank you, Rommel. I think the maybe will be the last because we have passed the time, but I can accommodate these last two questions, which share the silver linings. I think this is about the follow-ups after the after SNE. Ibu Wahyu asked, what is the urgencies of recalibrate? I think the SNE. I think the efforts are there. For instance, I don't know whether we can put it in the same box, but there is this Indonesia dalam Arus Sejarah, which also has several volumes and trying to encompass the nationwide history. What is the urgency of recalibrating it? Whereas Wildan Sena asked something about in the Philippines. Is there any other efforts or endeavors to write national history as fast and as big as the Tadhana projects? And he also left the comments about how someone like Pak Sartono could write a national history without government's support, direct support. And this has been, and according to Wildan, after Pak Sartono, there hasn't been any efforts to write that. And Wildan said that we are still waiting, or maybe it's us, the burden is on our shoulders to rather than we are still waiting for that. But of course, this is a very more than rigorous commitment to be able to produce some masterpieces like what Pak Sartono did. So Rommel, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Wildan, and yeah, for the question. It's an interesting question. We always have this tendency that because National History Writing Project really entails enormous amount of intellectual and financial resources. Therefore, the state must be the one to spearhead this kind of project. That's quite a common idea. In the Philippines as well, the scholars were very thankful. Those who participated in Tadhana, they were very thankful to somebody like Marcos, who was willing to provide a lot of money to finance a very huge, very ambitious project. So you can, it's not always you can find somebody, a politician who will have that kind of interest. And because he had that kind of interest, then a lot of historians were attracted to join in the project. But it's good that you mentioned that Pa Sartono wrote the 2 volumes. Actually, yeah, when I interviewed him, he specifically said that the reason why he wrote those history was precisely out of his frustration with what happened in the SNE. Okay, so how he felt so bad about what happened in that project, how problematic it was, and to demonstrate how it can be done. So he wrote those kind of things. He didn't write, of course, the next volume, and yeah, Bambang tried to mention about that kind of, perhaps he was holding back, so that kind of constipation on his himself. And Sarton also, I remember he was not really keen to discuss about the contemporary history. I specifically remember he told me that you have to step back in order for you to have that kind of historical perspective. You must be removed from the time, and doing history of the contemporary period, you are part of it. So you won't be able to assume that position of impartiality. Okay, so but the fact that he managed to do that, and actually if he liked to do the third one, he could have done it if he really liked it. So that demonstrates that there's really no need for a government support. If somebody like him can do it, then it can be done. That kind of project, it can be done well. So, but one thing that there's a part in the book where I discuss something like this, and this partnership between the state in the scholars was born out of their need for each other. Okay, so in due time in the future, when there is no need for, when the scholars themselves would be able to write history without the support of the state, then it could happen in the future. That could happen in the future. But so long up to now that is not yet possible, considering the fact that historians as lecturers in the university, they are doing so much other work, teaching, admin duties and all. So scholars in the Philippines can hardly really do research, any kind of research, much less this ambitious project of a national history. So one reason why they were enticed to join the Tadhana project was precisely because it provided very, very ideal working environment. The working environment for Tadhana scholar was much better than the one that happened under Sejarah Nasional in Indonesia. In Tadhana school, in Tadhana, that is their life for several years. Only that they will do. They will given all this kind of support to go to the archives overseas. Marcos was very stingy, but when it comes to this project, he didn't set any limit in terms of money. And he said, so long as it is needed, how much it would cost to acquire those kind of archival materials, go, no problem. So long as it is needed, wherever kind of archives you go in Europe or wherever, go in the United States, go. So, and back in the Philippines, every day they were being picked by boss from their own places, going back to the place of work. They were provided with typists, all of those kind of support. The research assistants. So they have actually, that was a heavenly kind of arrangement for the scholars. They're the only task, and they recall it very fondly, was that how ideal the situation was. All they do was to do scholarship, to do what they really like to do. They don't have to worry about any other things. And you see that kind of situation, you'd realize why scholars would be enticed to join this kind of project, because others who followed later, who joined later, they heard that this is how it looks like, how it goes. And that enticed other scholars to join that kind of very ideal working condition. And that can only be provided by the state and somebody who could be really provide a lot of money. Okay, so I think that's all that I can say.
Maybe
After what happened? There's another question.
Yeah.
What happened after the National Tadhana project? Actually, the Philippine historiography developed. Tadhana project served as a spin-off for an approach to history that is based on indigenous. And one of the most developed schools of thought in history in the Philippines developed from Tadhana. And once they are out of Tadhana project, it became a respectable project. More younger people, other scholars join in it. So basically, Philippines is known for a strong indigenization effort in history, psychology, and other social sciences. And part of the impetus for that was provided during the Tadhana. And other than that, there are other groups, there are other streams of historiographic development that happen. So it's a vibrant kind of development. Yeah. Okay. There's one more.
But I think you have slightly touched upon these issues about the effect, the after effect of the Tadhana. Moon asked about after the fall of Marcos, does it also signify the fall of the Tadhana projects? And then suddenly the narrative was very decentralized, and people are questionings about the cohesion in the national historiography. Maybe you can briefly touch upon that.
Oh yeah, so yes, as I was saying, so long as the approach was within Tadhana project, it was shunned. It was ignored and even vilified. But once it is outside of the Tadhana project, they flourish. Okay, so this kind of indigenous approach to psychology and history, they flourished in the Philippines. And it's true that Philippines, one of the frustrations among many Filipinos, including the intellectuals, are that kind of lack of cohesion. Okay, so usually it's being dubbed as supposedly proud of being democratic. It used to be that kind of showcase, Americans showcase of democracy in Asia. So it was presented as that, but actually many Filipinos long for the time when there's more discipline, cohesion, order, development, and that's the reason why a populist leader like Duterte, who promised to be like this, who became very popular. They became popular. And so there's this kind of longing for a more centralized, more cohesive kind of nation, more powerful kind of nation. And that's precisely what Marcos wanted the project of Tadhana was precisely that's the idea. And that's also the idea, that's also the reason this kind of longing for a cohesive, more stronger country. That's also the reason why a lot of Filipinos now are seeming some kind of nostalgic towards the Marcoses, that there's a possibility that the son of Marcos would become the next president. And of course, this horrifies the liberal groups in the Philippines, that after so many decades that they demonize Marcos, they put everything, all this kind of negative things about the Marcoses. Here we are on the cusp of having another Marcos for the next president. So that that will be a nightmare to these liberal intellectuals in the Philippines.
Okay, thank you, Rommel. I believe we should conclude with more or less a contemporary observations of how the post Tadhana and the more pragmatic situations that's not really different in Indonesia, as you know, the people are very nostalgic towards the new orders but although they are nostalgic, but I am quite skeptical that they return to Sejarah Nasional Indonesia to validate their feelings. But therefore we should conclude the book launch. I would like to thank Rommel, Pak Bambang, and all of the participants who have shared their minds and thoughts via the questions. This is a very fruitful is an understatement for this book launch, I believe, and I hope that there will be another discussions about the historiographies in the upcoming time. But I would like to also suggest everyone here to follow the now Department of History is active in social medias, and that's where we share our events. We have more than one seminar, webinars, book launch for each month, and the topics are very varied. From it's about everything. Even I think the previous seminar was only 1 or 2 weeks, 1 week ago. So it's very busy. We are very busy with this productive activities. So thank you for everyone involved, and I should close the session because it's already lunchtime in Indonesia. I believe I don't want to disrupt your schedule. Terima kasih and see you in another